Bienvenidos, Ushamdeed, and welcome to another Hut 8 Consulting Techtorial on Cisco's Enterprise Networking, Security, and Automation course, or ENSA. This is part of the new Cisco CCNA version 7 curriculum, and in this video we're going to be focusing on Packet Tracer Activity 6.8.1. Again, another fantastic activity on configuring NAT for IPv4, and I have in parentheses here challenge, because in this activity we are not provided with any of the commands required for configuration. And so I love activities like this because it really pushes us to recall and apply the previous material that has been covered. So we've talked about static NAT, we talked about dynamic NAT with a pool of inside global addresses, and we've talked about dynamic NAT overload, or PAT, port address translation. And so in this activity, we now have our NAT for IPv4 challenge activity, and here's the addressing table that we're going to be looking at. We're going to configure dynamic NAT with PAT. In other words, we're going to be configuring NAT overload. Now, one of the things I like about this activity is right down here when we go to create the NAT pool, because they throw in a little twist here. We haven't created a pool in which we're using a single address. And again, you might look at that and say, hey, wait a minute, how can a pool only have one address? I mean, isn't that sort of the opposite of the definition of a pool? Well, you can have a single address in the pool. And so sometimes learners will become a little confused as to how to configure that IP NAT pool statement when we get into the starting address and the ending address, as well as the subnet mask. But we're going to make that crystal clear here as we work our way through. Now, this is going to be a pretty short activity. There's not a lot to be configured here. So let's dive right in. So we're going to start here. Use a named ACL to permit the addresses from LAN 1, LAN 2, and LAN 3 to be translated. Specify the LANs in this order. In other words, LAN 1, 2, and 3 is how we're going to create the access control entries, or the ACEs, that are going to be in the ACL with the name R2 NAT. And those names must match. So let's bring down the router 2 window here. We're going to take up a little bit more space because we're going to be working primarily on router 2. And you can see we've got 3 serial interfaces, and then we have a fast Ethernet interface. All right, so let's go from user exec to privilege exec with the enable command. We'll use conf t, or configure terminal, to get into global config. And we're going to create an ACL. Now remember, it's a standard named ACL. So I cannot say access list because I can't put a name in here, right? I have to say IP access list. And then I would say standard, and we're going to give it a name. It's going to be R2 NAT. And again, that has to match, or else we're not going to get credit for this access control list. So what are we doing? Well, we're going to permit LAN 1, and they've made it easy for us here, right? It's going to be 192.168.10.0, and if it's a /24, we should have this down cold. Now, the reason I say they're making this easy is LAN 2 is 192.168.20.0/24. So instead of typing everything back out, let me just hit the up arrow here. Let me come down and change 10 to 20, and then LAN 3 is 30.0. So we'll change 20 to 30, and there's our ACL. You'll notice our completion percentage jumped to 20, and we're done with the first of the steps here in this activity. Now, what's next? All right, so we're going to create a NAT pool named R2 pool. The pool should use the first address from the 209.165.202.128/30 address space. Now, remember, a /30, we typically have 2 usable IPs, and then in sort of the IPv4 subnetting parlance or context, we have a subnet ID or network ID, and then we have a broadcast address. So there's 2 IPs we can't use and 2 IPs that we can use. And this is typically where on this the confusion may come in, because learners may look at that and they may think to themselves, okay, well, if it's 209.165.202.128/30 and I'm using it in the NAT context, then the 128 is going to be the first address. But that is not what they're looking for here. And really, when they say use the first, you could see how it's bold, right? First is in bold. Do you see that? I think what would help here would be to say use the first usable address from that address range, right? Maybe that would add a little clarification. And so let's knock this out. I've kind of given you the answer that you're going to need, but let's look at what the syntax looks like. So IP NAT pool, and the name of the pool is going to be R2 pool. And then what do? We have the starting IP, right? Which is going to be 209.165.202. And the first usable, which is what they're referring to here, is picking the first usable IP address in the IPv4 sort of subnet context. Now, what if I'm only using a pool with one IP? Well, can I just put netmask in here now? That's not going to work, right? Because after the starting IP, we have to put the ending IP. And when it's only one IP, it's the same IP. Right? So I love the twist that they added into this lab, which we have not seen in the previous packet tracer activities. So now the netmask, and sometimes you might see learners think that, okay, so it's only one IP, so I'm going to do a /32. Well, no, you're going to stick with the subnet mask as shown over here. And remember, we talked about this in the dynamic NAT video, which is as long as these two addresses, and they're the same address here, as long as that address would fall into a /30, we're going to be good. And we know that it would fall into a /30. So you can see the completion percentage is at 20. When I hit enter here, we should bump up, and we do, to 35%. All right. Now, all translated addresses must use this address as their outside address, and we're good to go. We've only indicated a single IP, 209.165.202.129. So now let's come down here. Configure NAT with the ACL and NAT pool that you've created. So let's bind the ACL and the NAT pool together so that we can identify, once we get our IP NAT inside and outside statements down on the interfaces, we can identify which inside local addresses are eligible for translation to an, I said local, yeah, which inside local addresses are eligible for translation to an inside global IP. And here's my inside global IP that we're using right there. All right, so we're going to say IP NAT source, IP NAT inside source list. And remember, typically we were doing like 1 or 2 because we were using numbered ACLs. But if I question mark here for the context sensitive help, take a look at that. We can put in a word, and we know that R2 NAT is the name of our ACL. Now, what are we going to do? We're not using an interface. We're using a pool of IP addresses, and then we put in the pool name. So R2 pool. And that is almost everything. Now, remember, we're using a single IP. And what could be misleading here is they use that term pool, right? So typically we would hit enter and then, hey, we're doing dynamic NAT. But remember, we want dynamic NAT with overload. And I think it's interesting how in the previous packet tracer, they stressed dynamic NAT with overload, dynamic NAT with overload. And here, what do they say? Dynamic NAT with PAT, right? So again, these are sort of all synonymous terms: port address translation, PAT, dynamic NAT with PAT, dynamic NAT with overload, NAT overload. Those all mean the same thing. And when configuring, we have got to have that overload keyword in there, because this is what is going to allow me to have multiple inside local addresses, many inside local addresses, leveraging or using a single inside global address in order to get access out to the internet via NAT and get a publicly routable IP. So we're at 35%. When I hit enter, you can see we jump up to 50%. Sorry about that. So now we're down here to the configure static NAT to map the local PKA server inside local address to the second address from the 209.165.202.128/30. So now you can see why they wanted us to use the 129, because here, and if you look up here, I thought it was interesting that they actually give you the value to use up here, and they make it kind of cryptic down here. So instead of just coming out and saying use 209.165.202.130, which they clearly show right there, they kind of make it cryptic here, right? So it's always good to check the network map, because there could be some answers to questions that you might have if you're looking down here and reading this and you're thinking, well, that doesn't make much sense. Like, okay, well, now I've got to figure out what's that next IP. Well, I can just look right up here and see that. And again, the static NAT is the easiest of all the NATs to configure, right? So we're going to say IP NAT inside source static, and then we do the inside local address, right? And you can see, I love how they do this when you have the context sensitive help. It says inside local IP. So what is the inside local IP we're using? Well, it's right there, 192.168.20.254. And then my inside global IP address. What's the publicly routable IP that we are going to perform the translation to? Well, we're going to translate it out to 209.165.202.130. And that's it. That is all you have to do for the static NAT configuration, and we go from 50% to 65%. Excuse me. Now, the final step is probably the easiest. I've seen my LAN segments 1, 2, and 3 respectively. That's going to be IPNAT inside, IPNAT inside, IPNAT inside, and then we've got the outside network. So on that serial interface, it's going to be IPNAT outside. So we're at 65%. We've got 4 interfaces to properly configure here. Let's see which interfaces are which by saying do show IP interface brief. And clearly, that is going to be the outside interface. So we'll take care of that one first. Let's get into int serial 010. Make sure I got that right there. And IPNAT outside. Right, that took us to 73%. Now let's jump into fast Ethernet 00, IPNAT inside. And then we're going to get into serial 000. Just use the up arrow, IPNAT inside. Interface serial 001. IPNAT inside, and that's all that we needed to do here. And so our NAT configuration, let's save our config just in case here. Let's do a quick show run. So there it is. We've got our IPNAT inside and outside definitions. And as you can see, here is my NAT pool. There is the, what are we doing there? That's the binding of the pool to the ACL, and making sure we declare overload so that we're using port address translation. And then I've got my static definition here for the local.pka server. And that is everything. You can see the ACL down here that we had previously configured. So that's all we needed to do in this activity. So now let's go ahead, and what we could do is just do a quick check here. So if I say show IPNAT translations, what are we going to see? Is it going to be empty? Or is it going to have at least one entry? And it's going to have that one entry that we're familiar with, and that is going to be the static NAT entry that we've placed in here. And you can see there it is right there. It's statically defined. Therefore, we don't need the outside local and outside global information on the definition, right, for the static definition. So there it is right there. Let's generate some traffic here. Let's come to PC1, and we'll give ourselves a little room here. And let's go to the desktop, let's go to the web browser, and let's type in http://cisco.pka. And we'll click go and check it out. We just hit the PKA web server. Let's come back over here and let's see, do we have any translations? We do, right? Protocol TCP, the inside global, right? The 209 publicly routable, and there is that sort of random high port, right? 1 to 1024 is reserved. So we start off at 1025. And there's the inside local mapping. And then we've got the outside global and outside local mappings, right? Going to port 80 because we did HTTP. I'm not sure if HTTPS would even function there. Let's give it a go. Let's see if we can make that happen. Let me click go here. And I can't tell if it's working or if we're just seeing the same page. So let's come up here and take a look. And sure enough, there it is, right? We end up with additional, and you may be looking at this thinking, wait a minute, that port number is way too big. But remember, that's the port numbers. It kind of runs together. The inside global column is running together with the inside local column. So you can see 1025, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31. So there we go. That is all that was required for this activity. Again, very straightforward, and that is going to do it for this activity. Packet Tracer Activity 6.8.1, Configure NAT for IPv4 Challenge. Again, best of luck to you in your studies. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.